I woke up to the distant rumble of engines, a sound that didn't belong on my land at this hour. For 57 years, I had risen with the sun, greeted by the quiet rustle of the fields, the lowing of cattle, and the scent of damp earth. This land wasn't just property to me. It was my family's legacy, carved from the raw prairie by my great-grandfather's hands and nurtured for generations. But today, something was wrong. I pulled on my boots and stepped onto the porch, blinking against the early morning light. Then I saw it bulldozers. A line of heavy machinery was rolling straight through my south pasture, chewing up soil that had been in my family for over a century. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I thought my heart had stopped. My land. My grandfather's land. They were tearing through it as if it were nothing but an inconvenience to be flattened and paved over. A hot wave of anger surged through me, wiping away the last remnants of sleep. I stormed across the yard, boots sinking into the soft dirt as I headed straight for the nearest worker. He barely looked up, sweat glistening on his forehead as he continued directing the bulldozer forward. The machine groaned, its massive blade carving deep scars into the soil, uprooting decades of hard work. I waved my arms, shouting over the mechanical roar, but the driver ignored me. My hands curled into fists as I spun toward a man in a bright orange vest, probably the foreman. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I demanded, my voice edged with fury. He barely flinched, adjusting his hard hat before offering me a dismissive glance. "Just following orders," he said flatly. "New road going in. HOA approved." My stomach churned. HOA, the Homeowners Association from the new development just beyond my property line. I had dealt with them before, but never like this. They had asked, demanded, access through my land for a shortcut to the highway. I had given them my answer in no uncertain terms. No. No deals, no easements, no negotiations. And yet, here they were, plowing through my land as if my refusal meant nothing. My pulse pounded in my ears as I turned to see a sleek black SUV rolling up the dirt road, kicking up clouds of dust. The door swung open, and out stepped the man I had come to despise more than any other, Tom Wilson, the HOA president. He was everything I hated about men like him. Arrogant, self-important, the kind of person who thought rules were for other people. Dressed in a crisp suit that had no business being on a construction site, he strode toward me with the smugness of a man who had already won. "Morning, neighbor," he said, flashing that politician's smile, all teeth and no sincerity. "Just a little road work, nothing to get worked up about." I took a step closer, barely keeping my voice steady. "You're trespassing," I said. "This is my land." He shrugged, glancing at the mess his crew had already made. "It's progress," he said smoothly. "Your land's in the way of progress. We need this road. You're being unreasonable." I clenched my jaw so hard it ached. "And I told you no." Tom's smile thinned. "We have ways of dealing with stubbornness," he said. "You should have taken the offer when you had the chance." My blood ran cold. I had heard those words before, always from men who thought money and power could bulldoze anything in their path. But this wasn't just about principle. This was my home. This was my family's legacy. I pointed at the destruction around me. "You think I'm just going to let this happen?" Tom's expression didn't change. "It's already happening." A muscle ticked in my jaw as I stepped back, taking in the scene, the ripped-up soil, the tire tracks cutting through what had once been pristine pasture land. My granddad used to say there were two types of men in the world, those who built and those who took. Tom Wilson was a taker. He didn't see this land as anything but an obstacle to be conquered. He thought he could do as he pleased, that no one could stop him. But he had made one crucial mistake. He underestimated me. I took a slow breath, forcing down the white-hot rage simmering in my chest. My wife Betty had always told me that anger was a fire that could either forge steel or burn everything down. Right now, I needed to be steel. I met Tom's gaze, steady and unwavering. "You're going to regret this," I said, my voice low. Tom chuckled, shaking his head like I was some foolish old man clinging to the past. "We'll see about that," he said. He turned and walked back to his SUV, leaving me standing in the wreckage of what had once been my land. I watched as the bulldozers kept moving, tearing deeper into the pasture, as if I wasn't even there, as if my voice didn't matter. I turned on my heel and walked back toward the house, my boots pressing deep into the churned-up dirt. They thought they had won. They thought I would just roll over and accept it, but they didn't know me. They didn't know what I was capable of. By the time I reached the porch, my hands had stopped shaking. Betty met me at the door, worry creasing her brow. "I called the lawyer," she said softly. "Good," I replied, "but I'm not waiting around for the courts to fix this." Betty's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't argue. She knew me too well. I wasn't a man to sit back and let others decide my fate. Tom Wilson had declared war on me and my land. And if he thought I was going to back down, he was dead wrong. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen over my land, I was already at work. My hands were calloused from years of farming, but today they clenched with a different kind of determination. The road those arrogant bastards had started carving through my land was still fresh, the deep tire tracks of their machines cutting scars through soil that had known nothing but crops and cattle for generations. The air smelled of torn earth and diesel, a bitter mix that made my stomach churn with rage. They thought they could take what was mine, roll over me like I was nothing, but they had underestimated the man standing in front of them. I climbed onto my Caterpillar backhoe, a machine I had used countless times to dig irrigation ditches and clear land. But today it had a new purpose. My fingers tightened on the controls, and as I pushed forward, the mechanical arm extended, sinking into the newly laid dirt like a predator sinking its claws into prey. With a groan of metal and force, I ripped into their precious road, dragging trenches deep enough to make it utterly useless. The morning air filled with the sound of breaking ground, of defiance given form. I worked methodically, destroying every inch of their progress, burying their arrogance beneath layers of ruined soil. By the time the first car rolled up, I had already turned their so-called progress into a useless, impassable mess. I shut off the backhoe and climbed down just as the SUV screeched to a stop. The door flew open, and there he was, Tom Wilson, HOA king himself, stepping out in his neatly pressed suit, his face turning a shade of purple that almost made me laugh. His mouth worked, trying to form words, but all that came out at first was a strangled, sputtering noise. "What the hell did you do?" he finally managed, his voice shaking with fury. I wiped the sweat from my brow and looked him square in the eye, my heart steady. "Fix your mistake," I said, my voice calm but firm. "This is my land, Tom. And I told you, you weren't building a damn road through it." Tom took a step forward, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the disturbed soil. "You son of a bitch," he seethed. "Do you have any idea how much this is going to cost? How many permits we had to pull? How many hours of work you just erased?" I let out a slow breath, feeling the satisfaction settle deep in my chest. "Not my problem," I said simply. "You didn't have permission. You thought you could take what wasn't yours. Now you're seeing what happens when you mess with the wrong man." Tom's hands clenched into fists, and for a second, I thought he might actually take a swing at me. Instead, he let out a sharp breath and pulled out his phone, jabbing at the screen with stiff fingers. "You're going to regret this," he muttered, stepping back toward his car. "I'll see you in court, old man. You have no idea who you're dealing with." I folded my arms across my chest, watching as he climbed back into his SUV, tires spitting gravel as he sped away. My pulse was steady, my resolve unshaken. Let him sue me. Let him try. This wasn't just about a road. It was about standing my ground, about protecting what generations of my family had bled and toiled for. No slick-talking HOA president was going to take that away from me. But I should have known Tom Wilson wasn't the kind of man to fight fair. The lawsuit arrived faster than I expected. a thick stack of legal papers shoved into my hands by a process server who barely met my eye before scurrying back to his car. I stood on my porch, thumbing through the pages, my jaw tightening as I read through the ridiculous claims. Obstruction of public development, destruction of essential infrastructure, even a section about me inciting hostility toward the HOA. It was absurd. The arrogance, the sheer audacity almost made me laugh. But Betty didn't laugh. She sat at the kitchen table that night, her fingers gripping her teacup tightly, her worry etched into the lines of her face. "This could get ugly," she said quietly. "Lawyers, court fees, all of it. They have money, they have connections." I reached across the table and took her hand in mine. "I don't care what they have," I said. "What they don't have is a right to my land, and I'll be damned if I let them win." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal meetings, paperwork, and tense conversations with my attorney. Tom Wilson, true to his nature, had pulled every string he could, calling in favors from city officials, pressuring local politicians to take his side. The HOA had painted me as some backward old farmer standing in the way of progress, spinning the story to make themselves look like the victims. But what they didn't count on was the truth. They didn't count on the fact that I had my own evidence, my own history with that land, and most importantly, they didn't count on how much I was willing to fight. The day before the first court hearing, I stood at the edge of my property, looking at the ruin they had left behind. The land still bore the scars of their intrusion, but I wasn't beaten. Not yet. Tom Wilson thought he could bury me in legal fees, grind me down until I had no choice but to give in. But he didn't understand men like me. He didn't understand what it meant to stand your ground, to fight for something bigger than yourself. As I looked out over my land, I felt the same fire in my chest that my great-grandfather must have felt when he first broke this soil, the same unyielding strength that had been passed down through the generations. They thought they could take what was mine. They thought they could break me. They were wrong. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with people eager to watch the battle unfold. Some were from the development, the same people who had waved at me from their manicured lawns when they first moved in, now whispering among themselves, convinced that the HOA was fighting for their best interests. Others were farmers like me, men and women who had spent their whole lives tending the land, their weathered faces set in grim determination. And then there was Tom Wilson, sitting at the plaintiff's table with his overpriced lawyer, the kind of man who made a living twisting words until they no longer resembled the truth. He was dressed in a sharp navy suit, his smug confidence barely contained as he sat with his arms folded, watching me like he had already won. He truly believed that money and influence would tip the scales in his favor, that I was just some stubborn old man fighting a battle he couldn't win. But he didn't understand that I had come prepared, not just with my lawyer but with the truth, with documents proving that my land was mine alone, with records that detailed every underhanded move the HOA had made, and most importantly, with the unshakable resolve that had been passed down through my family for generations. When the judge entered and the case was called, my lawyer stood, his voice steady, as he laid out our defense. The HOA had trespassed onto my land without permission, had destroyed my pasture, had illegally begun construction, and then had the audacity to sue me when I put a stop to it. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing, listened intently, her face unreadable as she flipped through the documents we had submitted. Then it was their turn. Tom's lawyer, a slick-looking man with a voice like silk, stood and began spinning his story. According to them, I had been unreasonable from the start, had refused to negotiate, had willfully damaged an essential infrastructure project that would benefit the community. He painted me as the villain, a bitter old man clinging to the past, unwilling to compromise for the good of others. I clenched my fists under the table, my nails digging into my palms, but I didn't let the anger show. I had to be patient. I had to wait. Then came the moment I had been preparing for. My lawyer stood and called our first witness, an engineer who had worked on the road project. I watched as Tom's smug expression wavered ever so slightly. The engineer, a man in his 30s with nervous hands, hesitated before speaking. He had been subpoenaed, forced to testify under oath, and as the questions came, his reluctance became evident. And then, the truth slipped out. The HOA had started construction without the proper permits. They had cut corners, used loopholes, and ignored the necessary legal processes because they thought no one would stop them. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Tom's lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The engineer tried to backtrack, to soften the blow, but the damage was done. The judge leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she asked for clarification, and when the engineer confirmed, albeit reluctantly, that the HOA had acted illegally, I saw the first real flicker of doubt cross Tom Wilson's face. But we weren't done. My lawyer called another witness, a city official who, after some careful prodding, admitted that the HOA had been pressuring the city to approve permits retroactively, trying to cover their tracks after the fact. More murmurs. The judge's frown deepened, and then came the final blow: documents. My lawyer laid them out carefully, showing clear evidence that the HOA had willfully trespassed, had ignored cease and desist letters, had even attempted to manipulate local officials to push their project through. Every piece of evidence was like another nail in their coffin, and as the judge reviewed them, I saw the shift in the room. The audience, once filled with quiet speculation, was now buzzing with realization. The HOA wasn't the victim here. They were the aggressors. Tom Wilson's face had gone from smug to pale. His lawyer, once smooth and confident, was now stumbling over his words, trying desperately to salvage what was quickly slipping away. But the judge had heard enough. She set down the papers and looked directly at Tom. Her voice was calm, but the weight of her words was crushing. The HOA had acted unlawfully. They had no right to build on my land. Their lawsuit was not only dismissed, but they were now facing counterclaims, damages for the destruction of my pasture, trespassing charges, and legal fees that would cost them more than they had ever anticipated. It was over. Tom shot up from his seat, his face red with rage. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, his voice cracking. "This man is standing in the way of progress. This is his fault. The judge silenced him with a single look, her patience clearly exhausted. "Sit down, Mr. Wilson," she said coolly. "You are lucky I am not holding you in contempt." He sank back into his chair, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. I didn't smile, didn't gloat, but deep inside, I felt the kind of satisfaction that came from knowing justice had been served. As we walked out of the courthouse, Betty squeezed my hand, her eyes filled with relief. The weight that had been pressing down on us for weeks had finally lifted. But as we stepped outside, I saw Tom standing near his SUV, his face twisted with fury. He locked eyes with me, and for a moment, I saw something dark there, something unsettled. He wasn't done, not yet. Some men, when they lose, accept it with dignity. Tom Wilson wasn't one of those men. And as I watched him clench his jaw, as I saw the barely contained rage simmering beneath the surface, I knew this fight wasn't over. Not yet. The days that followed the courtroom victory should have been filled with relief, but instead, there was an unease lingering in the air, like a storm gathering on the horizon. I had won, but Tom Wilson wasn't the kind of man to take defeat quietly. He had lost his lawsuit, been humiliated in front of the entire town, and now had to answer for the damage his reckless decisions had caused. But when men like him feel cornered, they don't walk away. They lash out. I saw it in the way he glared at me as he left the courthouse, the way his hands clenched at his sides, as if he was barely holding himself together. I had dealt with men like him before, entitled, arrogant, convinced the world should bend to their will, and I knew he wasn't finished with me. I just didn't know how far he was willing to go. That question was answered 3 nights later, when I was woken by the smell of smoke. The acrid scent burned my nostrils before my mind had even caught up, and by the time I shot out of bed, my heart was already pounding. Betty stirred beside me, her voice groggy with confusion. But I was already moving, yanking on my boots and throwing open the bedroom window. The sight that met me sent ice through my veins. The south field was on fire. The glow of the flames lit up the night sky, a swirling mass of orange and black, and in the distance, I could hear the crackling of burning grass, the frantic calls of my cattle as they panicked. Without thinking, I ran. The screen door banged against the frame as I tore across the yard, my legs moving on instinct. Smoke choked the air, thick and suffocating, and the closer I got, the more the heat clawed at my skin. But none of it mattered. My land, my home, was burning. I barely registered the roar of the fire department's sirens in the distance, didn't hear the shouts of my neighbors running toward the flames with whatever tools they could find. I only saw the destruction spreading before me. The land my family had cultivated for generations now blackened and curling beneath the relentless assault of fire. I grabbed a shovel, desperate, swinging it wildly at the creeping edges of the blaze, but it was useless. The fire was too big. I felt a hand on my shoulder, rough and firm, yanking me back. It was my neighbor, Daniel, his face streaked with soot. "It's too late," he shouted over the roar. "Let the firefighters handle it." I wanted to fight him, to push forward, to keep trying, but the truth was already sinking in. The fire had done its damage. The pasture was lost. By the time the flames were finally extinguished, the sun was creeping over the horizon, casting a dull, gray light over the smoldering remains of my land. I stood in the middle of it, my boots sinking into the charred earth, my hands hanging uselessly at my sides. The fire chief approached me, his expression grave. "No doubt about it," he said, voice rough from the long night. This was arson. The word settled heavily on my chest, not unexpected, but still sending a fresh wave of fury through me. I didn't need him to tell me who was responsible. There was only one man who had the motive, the arrogance, and the hatred to do something like this. Tom Wilson. The sheriff showed up an hour later, taking statements, asking questions, but I could see the frustration in his eyes. He knew as well as I did that men like Tom didn't leave evidence behind. There were no security cameras in the pasture, no witnesses to see who had started the fire. The best he could offer was a promise to look into it, but I knew that meant nothing. Tom had covered his tracks well. He would get away with it, and that knowledge sat in my gut like a stone. But if he thought this was the end of the fight, he had underestimated me one final time. Tom Wilson had played his last card, and he had played it poorly. He had shown the entire town exactly what kind of man he was. The HOA had already been reeling from the lawsuit, struggling to justify their actions to the community, and now they had a leader who was suspected of burning a man's land to the ground. The board members, once blindly loyal to Tom, started jumping ship. Some resigned outright, not wanting to be caught in the fallout. Others stayed just long enough to hold an emergency vote. Less than a week after the fire, Tom Wilson was removed as HOA president. But that wasn't enough for me. I took the fight one step further. With my lawyer's help, I filed a civil lawsuit against Tom personally, not just for the road, but for harassment, for damages, for emotional distress. The evidence from the original case was enough to make the lawsuit stick. And even though the arson couldn't be pinned on him directly, the stain of suspicion followed him everywhere. His name became poison in the community, and without the power of the HOA behind him, he was nothing. By the time the lawsuit was settled, he had lost more than just his position. He had lost his reputation, his standing, and a good chunk of his money. One afternoon, months after it all began, I stood at the edge of the south pasture, the land still scarred but slowly healing. New grass had started to push through the blackened soil, stubborn and unyielding, just like me. Betty joined me, slipping her hand into mine, her fingers warm despite the cool autumn air. "You did it," she murmured. "You fought back." I exhaled, watching the wind dance across the fields. "I did what I had to," I said, "just like my father did, just like his father before him." I turned to look at her, a small smile playing at the corner of my lips. They thought they could take what was ours. They were wrong. She squeezed my hand, and together, we stood there, watching the land return to life, knowing that no matter what came next, we would face it the same way we always had, head-on, unshaken, and unwilling to ever back down.